The steps of City Hall were packed today with a new group that believes everyone in Duluth deserves a stable and comfortable place to live.
Northern News Now's Jeffrey McClure heard from Duluth Tenants Union as they begin what they call a fight for renters' rights.
I have had doors that don't lock. I have had heat that doesn't work into the cold months of October and November. I've had broken windows. I've dealt with all sorts of things as a renter.
Diana Grandal has long struggled to find a comfortable place to live in Duluth. Experiences that sparked her fight to find a solution starting almost 2 years ago.
Tenant power! Tenant power! That's right!
Wednesday, Diana helped launch the Duluth Tenants Union on the steps of City Hall. About 100 members showed up, including state and city leaders like Representative Leash Kozlowski, who was one of the first 5 members knocking on doors.
From West End to Lakeside, countless doors, talking to renters, to homeowners, and everybody in between, folks who have a house, folks who wish that their neighbors had houses.
The union is focused on the affordability, livability, and availability of housing in the city. Multiple speakers shared stories of the trouble of finding a place, mistreatment by landlords, and terrible living conditions.
We've already been in a crisis of availability. We don't have enough housing units. And so we feel very clear that the units that we have, we need to take such good care of them and make sure that they are well maintained.
Naseem Farahid came to Duluth in 2016 from the country of Jordan, hoping for what many dub the American dream. Farahid admitted he now lives in a better situation thanks to a better landlord.
It's just that human aspect of not being treated like I'm just income coming to a landlord.
In Duluth, Jeffrey McClure, Northern News Now.
Now, with the union going public today, they say they're just getting started. There's no official legislation for which they're advocating just yet.
They plan to call for community-led solutions and invite everyone to attend their next meeting on November 6th at the Minnesota Take Action office.